Hello, my name is David Williams, and this is a story about who we are as human beings. The question has haunted people since the beginning of time, maybe even before the dawn of language. But once people were able to create stories and question, they could come up with answers. We were born from a cosmic egg, or we emerged from the center of the earth. A god blew life into our nostrils after making us from mud, or trickster fashioned us from dung. There are hundreds of stories born from the creative thinking of our ancestors, who then borrowed those stories from others and embellished them again and again in the pre-literate game of telephone, where the tale is altered over and over as it's being told. Finding the absolute truth didn't matter to ancient tribal people, as they usually took the view that there are many different versions of truth, and that was okay. Therefore, they were often open-minded about mythology, religions, trading and borrowing them freely from each other. The first gods were animals, usually the animals people ate and depended upon for food: the buffalo, the salmon, the elephant, the deer. Then the gods and goddesses came in human form, and were almost always portrayed as having human weaknesses and emotions like anger, jealousy, lust, and greed, often playing tricks on mankind, as most of the deities were far from loving and kind. When writing came into the world, such stories became solidified for the first time. For when something is written in stone, clay, or papyrus, it takes on a new luster, becoming official, imperial, and much harder to revise. Myths were romantic and full of drama, but they almost always got things wrong. That's because no one thought there was a need to check the facts, to test, to verify. If someone made up a story that storms were caused by the gods throwing thunderbolts because they were angry at human beings being too noisy, that would be accepted and passed down. Tribal people, our ancient ancestors, lived in a world of superstition. Everything in their universe was animated, and everything had intention behind it. If you got sick, it was because someone or some supernatural being infected you on purpose. This led to constant suspicion and wrong conclusions. The Aztecs had to cut the hearts out of people to keep the sun going around the earth, as the gods demanded blood. Other gods needed sacrifices of chickens or goats to keep things running smoothly. This kind of thinking led medieval Puritans to burn witches at the stake, poor women who had nothing to do with creating a plague or a catastrophe. But about 400 years ago, the scientific method was born, based on the idea that explanations had to be verified through experimentation and peer review. And science demanded that natural causes be found to explain the world, not supernatural ones, which could never be tested. The idea was that there was a concrete physical world outside the world in our heads, and it could be known through rational means. Science gave us a unique way of talking to each other, as the rules were the same, whether you spoke Mandarin or Cherokee. Since that time, scientists have discovered remarkable facts about who we are and how we originated. According to science, all creatures on Earth are related to one another: a blade of grass and a blue whale. That's because all life started once on Earth, and every living thing, plant and animal, is a descendant of that original spark. We are all relations. This view of the world has been proven over and over again through fossils, biology, and the discovery of genetics and DNA. The story tells us that humans came from a long line of earlier ape-like ancestors who originally shared a common link with chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. We're classified as primates in the animal kingdom, which means we have eyes to see in color, with stereoscopic vision, which is good for picking out one tree branch from another. When you're swinging, going after fruit, we have arms that can brachiate, large brains and fingers with opposable thumbs for holding onto those tree branches. We share many other traits with our closest cousins, the chimps, including about 98% of our DNA. We both engage in kissing, shaking hands, hugging, vying for dominance and power, and we're happy when we're on the top and depressed when we sink to the bottom. We form alliances, friends, hunt for meat, mourn the death of loved ones, and make war on fellow members of our species. It makes sense that our earliest hominid relatives did the same. Hominid meaning those that walk upright on two legs. Many people don't know that the move from ape-like relations to us did not go in a straight line. Evolution always works by branching out, and there is never some fixed point or outcome it is directed toward. Every living thing is the result of its own evolutionary story. Sometimes evolution occurs in starts and fits. So there were many hominid species that developed in Africa and lived there simultaneously, possibly 20 or 30 over time. Some hominid species became extinct, but others became our ancestors. Our early two-legged relations, about the size of chimps, with chimp-like brains, were not great hunters. They were vulnerable and ill-equipped for predators once they left the safety of the trees. But walking upright had some advantages, like seeing greater distances or the ability to carry things with your hands. But the greatest advantage was an economy of movement, for walking on two legs is a lot more efficient than knuckle walking as chimps and gorillas do today. Ancient hominids could walk across the African savanna and look for food when it was scarce. Some scientists think that it was walking around in the heat of day that really began the change for early hominids to increase the size of their brain due to the specifics of thermodynamics. Scavenging in the heat of day also meant greater safety from predators who tended to hunt at night. Homo habilis, some 2.5 million years ago, learned to shape stone tools in order to crack open the bones of the largest animals that even the hyenas and lions could not get to with their teeth. And that bone marrow supplied a fantastic energy source rich in fat that was essential to a larger brain. Chimps today will also use stones to crack open nuts, so it's quite possible that this technology has been around a lot longer than Homo habilis before they actually learned to fashion specific tools out of stone. And eventually a hominid came along that began to look more human than ape, and that was Homo erectus, who had a brain only half to two-thirds our size. But Homo erectus could use fire and make more sophisticated tools. They no doubt lived in tribal hunting and gathering societies, the dominant form of economy that would shape our species for most all of our existence. Homo erectus stood about 6 feet tall, but still had the huge brow ridges of earlier apes. But they were moving into some new and mental and physical terrain, even though their Stone Age technology stayed exactly the same for over 1 million years. But they were the first to leave Africa and populate Asia and Europe, and eventually some of their descendants evolved into the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and probably Florence's man. And then in Africa, some 200,000 years ago, one branch of Homo erectus turned into us, Homo sapiens. Our species had the largest brains of all, and eventually things started moving in our ancestors' minds that went beyond what Homo erectus had ever imagined. 130,000 to 80,000 years ago, something happened and we had a huge mental leap. Brains got larger and more complex, and the mythic mind was born. No longer was life just a day-to-day existence until you die. Stories came into being that gave humans purpose and a worldview of belief. The spiritual world was invented that ran alongside the visible one. Homo sapiens began to think symbolically and abstractly, creating swirls of art, body ornamentation, and language and higher thought began to become the dominant traits of our species. Somewhere around 80,000 to 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, some of them left Africa with these new abilities, speaking, thinking, and with new toolkits like the bow and arrow, spear throwers, and clothing that was sewn. DNA has shown that the closest living people to our ancient ancestors are the pygmies of Africa, the Bushmen who speak the mysterious click languages. Our ancient forebears must have looked much like them, for in these astounding people you can still see traits of every ethnic group on Earth. They are gracile, fine-boned, inventive, and keenly aware of their environment. Our ancestors went all the way to Australia, up through Asia, and into Europe. And it was there that they ran into Homo erectus populations who had been living for 200,000 years, their long-lost cousins. In Europe, Homo erectus had turned into Neanderthal, a cousin species who actually had brains larger than Homo sapiens, though they still maintained the heavy brow ridges and lack of chin of earlier Homo erectus. They did not seem to have evolved quite the same quality of symbolic thought as our species, and they were more limited in tool-making, invention, and in their social connections. They were short but immensely strong, and they led very hard lives. Their fossilized bones attest to this, for many were left fractured, broken again and again as they pursued huge and dangerous Ice Age mammals at very close range, for their technology demanded that they must get close. But after living in Ice Age Europe for 200,000 years, Neanderthals died out only 30,000 years ago, probably due to our species putting pressure on their resources and possibly through warfare. But it's not the entire end of the story, for recent DNA evidence has shown that non-African populations of humans carry about 4% of Neanderthal genes. So breeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did occur on a limited level, and something of Neanderthals lives on in many of us. A new species of ancient humans was also recently discovered to have lived in Asia called the Denisovans, some of whom mated with Neanderthals, and 6% of their genes can be found in populations today in Melanesia. But the most incredible ancient human find of all is Florensis man, who was discovered not long ago in Indonesia. Sometimes called the Hobbit people, these humans were only about knee-high and appeared to have many more traits of Homo erectus than Homo sapiens. Amazingly, they disappeared only 13,000 years ago, which was the last time on Earth that another human species lived besides us on this planet. When they vanished, we were, for the very first time ever, the only hominid species on Earth. Homo sapiens lived for most of life on Earth, just like Homo erectus did, in small units, tribes that hunted and gathered for food. Our line evolved a specialization that was unique, different lifestyle roles for the two sexes, which can be seen in even the last hunting and gathering peoples who have survived into contemporary times. In human tribal societies, men do the hunting and women gather fruits and vegetables and spend most of the time devoted to the children. This scheme for survival worked well for our ancestors and played out over and over through 99.9% of our existence on Earth. It led to changes in the brains of men and women at about 3% as we became specialized for various tasks. These are not culturally dependent. These are biological changes that start in the womb. All embryos begin as female, but testosterone alters the males. And one result is that the two hemispheres of women's brains are much more tightly linked together, whereas the brains of men are more compartmentalized. Only about 10,000 years ago, hunting and gathering people around the world began to realize that they could plant seeds of wild plants and return to harvest them. It was the first step toward true agriculture, which blossomed some 5,000 years later, becoming the greatest change for humans that ever occurred and the greatest change for the planet and the rest of life. With agriculture, more food could be produced, and with more food, more children could be born and survive. Agriculture and the accompanying domestication of animals like cattle, sheep, and goats allowed for permanent settlements to be established, villages, towns, and eventually large cities. The dwellings of people changed. Humans did not have to live nomadically following game. Eventually, monumental architecture was invented, such as ziggurats, pyramids, and temples to the gods. Religion became associated with these rising states, and priestly castes emerged who had the only direct access to the gods. Where tribal people had lived life in egalitarian societies, with no one having formal power over another, in state-level societies, distinct classes came into existence. From farmers to work the fields, to royalty at the very top. And for the very first time, people had stuff. Elaborate clothing, shoes, pots, pans, chariots, jewelry, furniture, and more. And of course, the most wealthy began to accumulate fine goods of all kinds as a whole new class of artisans were employed to provide goods for the aristocracy. With stuff also came the desire for more stuff, and armies had to be formed, creating another class, the military, to go to war to steal stuff from others or to prevent others from stealing stuff from you. Writing was developed, with cuneiform clay tablets written upon with a stylus. Originally, it was not for preserving lofty ideas. It was used to keep track of how much grain a farmer brought into the granary, a receipt. Eventually, of course, people realized you could do much more with this. Laws were written down for the very first time, as well as the mythologies that formed religions. With cultures borrowing tales furiously from each other to establish their own official link to the past. Part of the Sumerian story of Gilgamesh, for example, eventually made it into the much later Bible of the Israelites to become the story of the flood, while the princess Enheduanna's story of her father, King Sargon, turned into the Jewish legend of Moses. Agriculture and state-level societies utterly changed the way people lived. In tribal societies, humans never had jobs, never had to answer to a boss. Anthropologists have revealed through studies of work that tribal people spent only some 20% of their lives working to maintain themselves, and on a daily basis expend the same amount of physical energy as the average office worker. The story of the Garden of Eden, with man expelled from paradise, is really an apt metaphor for the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, or working as a full-time soldier, or living by the sweat of your brow, farming, herding, building, or manufacturing goods. The personal lives of men and women became drastically different in other ways as well. Men and women in tribal societies tend to have a good deal of equality, even though the tasks of men and women are different. But civilization severely altered the status of women, as in many places, women not lucky enough to be born into royalty came to be considered chattel, with few rights and little status. But agriculture allowed people to rise dramatically. Some 80,000 years ago, there were only about 100,000 Homo sapiens on Earth. We almost died out 74,000 years ago as an environmental crisis caused us to dwindle to only 12,000, which accounts for the reason that all the humans on Earth are more closely related to each other than other mammals. For instance, in just one troop of chimpanzees, the diversity of DNA is 4 times greater than it is for all the humans on Earth. Agriculture allowed us to expand again dramatically, as the following slides will show. It took all of prehistory and most of recorded history to finally reach 1 billion people in 1800. It took only 127 more years to reach the next billion, 33 more to reach the next, then 14, 13, 12, and now we're up to 7 billion people. But when I was a kid, we were only at 3 billion. Agriculture also led to the second environmental crisis caused by man, the first being the overhunting of the Pleistocene Ice Age mammals, who are now thought to have, it was thought that early man had a large hand in killing off the great Ice Age creatures like the woolly mammoths, rhinoceros, and ground sloths. But with agriculture, all the great cities, from the Middle East to China, Mexico, and Europe, suffered environmental devastation that in many cases caused these various civilizations to fall, as resources were overused, trees decimated, and soils destroyed. But nothing can match what has happened since the Industrial Revolution and the last 100 years of invention and expansion. For some of us on Earth, living has never been better. We play with amazing gadgets, fly hither and yonder at will, have more food to eat than any hunter-gatherer could ever have dreamed possible. And we are free to learn and discover with access to incomparable amounts of knowledge. Yet billions of humans do not even have clean water to drink or the minimal amount of calories to survive. And we are losing our fellow companions on Earth, non-human companions, at an alarming rate. National Geographic has declared this the sixth great extinction the Earth has ever faced, the last coming with the end of the dinosaurs. For all of time, we have lived alongside a huge raft of species who have evolved with us here on Earth, many of whom will be gone in 10 or 20 years, along with huge swaths of rainforest where the vast majority of species on the planet thrive. Many of these animals were long ago enmeshed in our mythologies and stories, often serving us as symbols we all recognize, from tigers and lions to bears, whales, elephants, rhinos, apes, monkeys, and birds and fish of every stripe. Soon, many will be gone. Ironically, all of this is occurring as we are learning for the very first time about our own brains through the study of neuroscience, which is showing over and over again how alike we and our animal relatives are to one another. Our evolutionary journey is portrayed in the very structures of our brain, as we carry ancient neurons and the ancient wiring of fish, reptiles, and mammals inside our own skulls. Likewise, we have now become aware of the hominid past that lives in us as well, how we are the living endowment of our ancestors, for it is their genes, the genes of tribal people over the vast expanse of time, that have given us life, endowed us with pleasures of thinking and feeling, giving us their emotions, motivations, and desires, whether we realize it or not. For we are the past incarnate, the living embodiment of ancient genetic material that crawled up from the sea and survived long enough to become conscious with consciousness, aware of being aware, here in the very moment we are in.